Hi. We'll get started here. I know you're all here to hear Debbie, but I have a few announcements first for summer sessions. My name is Martha Bristow, and I'm here to welcome you. This is our penultimate Discover Alaska lecture. And next week, we'll wrap up our Discover Alaska series with Brian O'Donohue of the UAF Journalism Department. Brian will give us background and updates on the 1997 John Hartman murder case and the efforts of journalists and others to bring new attention to the case and reevaluate the evidence. So next week is the final week for all of our evening programs, so come on out and enjoy them. Trying to remember, we have the slides up for the music program. This week is the steel drums, and next week is Emily Anderson. Emily Anderson is one of my former students, so she's wonderful. I'm very excited that she's one of our musicians. So we're ending with Emily Anderson. So please take this opportunity to take your cell phone out and silence it or put it in airplane mode. And then if one goes off, you can blame me. So I'm going to get on with it. Get my pages out of order. I'm pleased to introduce freelance writer, photographer, and conservationist Debbie Miller to you tonight. It's an honor on many levels. I've heard her name for years, and I've never met her before, so I was delighted to meet her tonight. And I'm always happy when an Alaskan writer gains a national voice, and Debbie has done that. She is a 40-year Alaska resident, and she's celebrating that milestone this year, and first gained an appreciation for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge when she taught school in Arctic Village, a small Athabascan community in the Brooks Range. In the ensuing years, Debbie has hiked hundreds of miles and in the refuge and written about it in various publications for children as well as for adults. The Arctic Refuge is a 19.3 million acre refuge established in the northeast corner of the state. Since the late 1970s, the refuge's coastal plain has become the focus of political debate. To drill, baby, drill, or not to drill, baby, drill. And I think Debbie will probably have some ideas about which course to take. She is known for mixing adventure and detailed, accurate nature writing. One of her best-known books is Midnight Wilderness, Journeys in Alaska's Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, first published by Sierra Club Books in 1990 and by Mountaineer Books in 2011. It's in demand on Amazon. I looked it up. There was only one left today. And they said more are on the way. And I believe we have some here tonight. Debbie has also written 15 nonfiction children's books about nature, such as Survival at 40 Below, and her most recent book, A King Salmon Journey, published by the University of Alaska Press last year. Her books are used in elementary schools across the nation, and she's received all kinds of endorsements from science teachers for her books, which I thought was pretty impressive. If you are interested in purchasing some of Debbie's books, the University of Alaska Press has some of her children's books available out on the tables out front. The Northern Alaska Environmental Center is also here with additional information about the Arctic Refuge, along with a limited number of copies of Midnight Wilderness and Grizzly Bears of Alaska. Debbie is happy to autograph any of these books for you after the program. So without further blah, 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 I'm going to turn things over to Debbie. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Martha. Appreciate that. And thanks to everybody that decided to come out on a beautiful summer evening. Maybe you had a little thunder and lightning on the way. Makes for an exciting evening when we have thunder and lightning in Fairbanks. It's great to be back here in town. I've been traveling to Australia and spent a lot of time in Northern California taking care of my 90-year-old dad earlier this year. So I have not been in Fairbanks very much, and it's wonderful to be back And I realized just last week that this August marks the 40th anniversary of arriving in Alaska. So it's been a pretty nostalgic time looking through old photographs, old slides, digital pictures. You know, we've had quite a few changes in 40 years with photography, and piecing together a program for tonight was a little emotional in some ways, just to look back and to realize that the kinds of experiences that I've had in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, these are indelible types of wilderness adventures that, you know, that will stay with me forever. And I just feel blessed and fortunate to be able to share these trips that I've taken, the knowledge that I've gained through people in Arctic Village, where I first lived with the Gwich'in Athabascan people, who taught me about their culture, their language, even how to tan a caribou skin, you know, with handmade tools made out of moose leg bones and this kind of a thing. It was just a phenomenal experience teaching there. And I want to thank the University of Alaska for hosting this talk tonight. The Discover Alaska lecture series is fantastic, and I'm really sorry that I missed some of the lectures that went on this summer, and pleased to be a part of it. So let's move right in to the Arctic Refuge, the past, the present, and the future, which right now it's a very good time for the refuge. As you probably have read in recent months, President Obama has recommended that the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge and part of the southern extension of the Arctic Refuge from the Lands Act, about 12 million acres, is proposed for an official wilderness designation. And he actually has made that proposal to Congress as of March of this year. Very exciting. And so there is a House bill in Congress that is co-sponsored by 90 different representatives that support wilderness for this area. It would be the largest designation of wilderness in our country, I think, since the Lands Act, or maybe the largest ever, I'm not sure, but a lot of wilderness would be added to our national system. And so that is very exciting news. So let's go there, and I'll share with you some of the highlight pictures that I've taken over the years, some of the adventures, and some of the pictures are taken by Hugh Rose, who's a wonderful friend, a guide, and a photographer who I worked with on the Arctic Wings book. So you'll see some of his bird pictures. And the sounds that you'll be hearing in this program were recorded by my friend, colleague, adventure partner, traveler, Richard Nelson. So this is a you would say, a multimedia experience, hopefully for you. So the East Fork of the Chandeleur River is what you're looking at, and you're looking at tree line. I think of this as the gateway to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. This is where the boreal forest stops growing. And beyond that line of trees that you see, you only have tundra and mountains that go up to 9,000 feet, and willow bushes and small, wildflowers that hug the tundra. But you're looking at the edge of timberline north of Arctic Village, which is where the journey began. And this is the picture taken in 1975 when Dennis and I were traveling to Arctic Village I was to be a teacher there. I was frankly a little terrified because I didn't know any Athabascan people. I did not know the language. And at that time, the Gwich'in language was a first language, English was a second language, and I was a 24-year-old teacher who had taught for 2 years in California, in Northern California. And I'm on this airplane, and we're going to a place for a year with a year's supply of food, and I have no idea what I'm getting into. But this was the view. It was like New England in miniature. The colors were extraordinary. And I remember thinking, as this little four-seater bush plane went towards Arctic Village and the Brooks Range there in the distance, I remember thinking of the Inuit quote in Kenneth Brower's book, Earth and the Great Weather, which maybe some of you remember that, where the poetic quote is, "Earth and the great weather have carried me away and moved my inward parts with joy." And that's the way I felt. I felt that the earth and the great weather was really moving me as we approached Arctic Village in the fall. This is August of 1975. And then to live in this village, what an adventure and what a marvel to see how the Gwich'in Athabascan people had adapted to one of the harshest environments we have in the world, really, living above the Arctic Circle. For 2 months, we did not see the sun rise. And these people were hardy. They knew how to live off the land. They knew how to gather the resources, whether it was blueberries or moose or caribou in the fall or ducks in the spring or setting fish nets underneath the ice of a lake. These people knew how to survive. And their stories of survival were incredible. And so this is Trimble Gilbert, who was coming home from a successful moose hunt on the Chandeleur River. And actually, Trimble's grandson is actually here tonight. He's sitting in the back row, Matthew Gilbert, and his father was a student in my class. And that was 1975, so that dates me a little bit, doesn't it? Matthew, you make me feel really old. But it's great that you could be here, because your grandfather was just an incredible person, still is an elder of Arctic Village with countless stories, wonderful man, and taught us a lot about living off the land. And then your great-grandfather, Matthew, is in this picture. This is James Gilbert, and he was coming back after checking his fish net on the lake with a big supply of fish in August of that year. Fish that he would freeze, dry, smoke, to have all winter for extended family, where everything was shared amongst family and friends in Arctic Village. And then before you knew it, the snow was falling, and people were, after they'd harvested the caribou, the women would be very busy tanning the caribou hides. Now, these are all caribou hides that were tanned by a woman named Margaret Tritt. And she was my teacher in those days, and she taught me actually how to tan a skin, which is really hard work. It just was an amazing amount of strength you had to have in your hand and forearm to flesh out a skin using, in those days, it was a moose leg bone that was sharpened on the bottom of the leg bone, and you would sit there fleshing around in a circle all the way down to where it got soft and all the flesh came off. It was a long process to tan a skin, and that was what was going on in the fall, and snow on the ground by the end of September. And then, of course, the days got shorter, and we lost the sun for 2 months beginning around Thanksgiving. The sun went down. It was still light and beautiful, indirect twilight, sunrise, sunset colors that lingered through the day, but no direct sunshine for 2 months. But lovely moon rises in the northern lights. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Arctic Village or the Arctic Refuge, this is just a map to get you a little oriented. And you can see the Arctic Refuge is in the northeastern corner, over 19 million acres of wild lands, roadless lands, pristine lands, primitive lands, untrammeled lands, all the things that you think about. When you think of the definition of what is wilderness, that is what is inside those boundaries. Arctic Village is on the southern boundary, right where you see a jigsaw piece sticking up in the map. It's right there. I don't know if the laser works on the screen, but it's just below the R of refuge. And that's where we were for the first 2 years, or actually the first 4 years we lived up in that area. Well, I can't go very far in a program about the Arctic Refuge, especially since we're in the Margaret Murray building, not to mention the first woman to graduate from the University of Alaska, a longtime friend of many of us, a mentor, a matriarch, and a wonderful, wonderful person, Margaret Murray, and her husband, her biologist husband, Olas Murray. And about 20 years prior to when we arrived in Arctic Village, Olas and Marty were planning their first expedition into the Chugach River drainage to study the area for the purpose of establishing a wilderness area in the Arctic forever, to be put aside to protect the wildlife, the wilderness. And as Olas was a biologist, they went up to record what was there, what lived there, what moved there, what was the country like. It was an adventure for them. They were pioneers. And so off they went with 3 scientists, one of them, Bryna Kessel, an ornithologist, who still, I believe, is living in Fairbanks. And George Schaller, a very famous scientist, was up on the Chugach on Lobo Lake, which they named Lobo Lake during their trip, and Bob Creer. And this was from her journal, which I love, because this was so indicative of the place and what was really there. They were there to record. And no one had really visited this area and written about it for people in the lower 48, as we would say, or for even Alaskans. And I love the way she wrote. I have watched a band of 50 caribou feeding back and forth on a flat, a quarter of a mile away, ptarmigans soaring and clucking and giving their ratchety call all about. Tree sparrows so close and unafraid, cliff swallows hurrying by, Wilson snipe and yellow lakes calling, gray-cheeked thrushes singing. The 3 scientists are beside themselves with all there is to see and do and record. The only sounds we hear are the sounds of the land itself. That is pure, unadulterated wilderness, isn't it? When all you hear are the sounds of the land itself, the Arctic Refuge. And there they are near the Tetons near Moose, Wyoming, where they spent a good portion of their life. I was lucky enough to visit Marty before she died when she was about 98 years old. And she lived to be 101. And she was a mentor to so many of us, such an inspiration, having lived in Fairbanks, having explored the Brooks Range, having been the strongest, she and Olas, advocates to establish the original Arctic National Wildlife Range. They gave many public programs in Alaska, in Fairbanks. In fact, the first proposal to establish the Arctic Range was right here in Fairbanks, the Tanana Valley Sportsmen's Association. They drafted a public proposal to create the original Arctic National Wildlife Range. So this is really a Fairbanks-based initiative that happened back in the late 1950s, and they were really the inspiration for that. In another way, which got me teary today, Marty Murray was an inspiration to me when I wrote my book, Midnight Wilderness, because I was pregnant with our second daughter, didn't think I'd be able to finish the book, and she wrote me monthly letters, which really meant a lot, and I saved them all. They're all going to be archived here at the university. Without those little letters of inspiration, I don't know if I would have finished the book with a 2-year-old at home. And she was helpful because she had raised children and been a writer, so she knew what I was going through, and she was very encouraging. And in this particular letter, she was thanking me because I was doing research in the archives, and I discovered a tape, an audio tape of Olas giving a talk somewhere, I think, here in Fairbanks, and she had not heard it. So I was able to get a copy and send it to her, and of course he had passed on many years before this, and so she was writing about that experiencing of hearing his voice again and what it meant to her. So they were very close as a couple and wonderful people, the Murrays. And then we honored them later on, and Fran and his wife, who's here tonight, Fran Maurer is here, at the annual Arctic Refuge run on Marty Murray's 100th birthday. He and Yuriko, his wife, wore these great bibs. Happy birthday, Marty. Happy birthday, Mother of the Refuge. This would have been, I think this would have been right around 2001 or 2002, because I think she was born in 1902. So it would have been, 2002, when it was her 100th birthday. Do you remember that, Fran? Yeah, you do. Okay. So that was a great honoring of her. And then another pioneer that how many of you knew Jenny Wood? Okay, so we all know what she meant to this community as a wonderful person, as a conservationist. She and Celia Hunter formed the Alaska Conservation Society together, largely because of the drive to protect the Arctic, the original Arctic range. And when they started their little conservation group here in Fairbanks, there were only like 12 people in the group. And they would meet at their cabin and sit around having lunch, and they would talk about the hearing that was going to be in Fairbanks about the proposed Arctic range, which in those days, the politicians came from Washington, D.C. to Fairbanks to hear what people thought about whether or not we should pass legislation that would create the range. And so Ginny passed away recently. This picture was taken on the 4th of July. I spent with her in 2010. We're eating some blueberry pie. And she was having a great day. And this is what she said in 1959 when she was at the hearing in Fairbanks. We Alaskans must reconcile our pioneering philosophy of conquer, cut, shoot, plow, mine, and move on to the realization that the wild country that lies now in Alaska is all there is left under our flag. I really love that. Because so much of the settling of America has been conquer, cut, shoot, plow, mine, and move on. And here we're at the end of the road, guys. This is it. We have to be stewards, because what we have here is gold. And I don't mean gold under the ground. I mean the values above the ground. And so that was a great thing that she said. And if you're curious about the hearing, that there were several hearings in Alaska in 1959, and I think it was 73 people voted in favor of the proposed Arctic range, and I think there were 50 some odd that were against. So it was controversial, but the majority of people supported it, and the Arctic range ended up being established in 1960, right after statehood, by executive order under President Eisenhower. It was born during the very final hours of his presidency. So the eggs of the common loon, and of course the common loon had to sing. Get it louder. I don't know if we can get the speakers louder on the sound, but I just thought it's just coming off of my computer. Oh yeah, there we go, the mic. Brilliant. We'll see if that works. I like that idea. Yeah, let's see. Let's try it. Because there are quite a few sounds I really would like folks to hear the sound. So let's see this. You never know about sound and systems, but the common loon, such a beautiful call, such a beautiful wail, such a beautiful yodel. And I grew up in Northern California near San Francisco, and I was kayaking this past year, and I came across about 40 to 50 common loons that were gathering in this large group. And I had no idea that they gathered in groups like that, because in Alaska we usually see them in pairs nesting, and we might see them with their young, and in the winter they gather together in these large groups. So back to Arctic Village, of course, when you're teaching, you have the summers off, and that began our series of adventures in '75 of traveling along these pristine rivers like the Canning River, the Marsh Fork of the Canning River, one of my favorites, exquisite river that flows north from the Brooks Range all the way to the ocean. And this picture really dates you. So check out the felt hats Keltie pack, which I still own and use, and I'm going to ask the question, how many of you still have your Keltie packs from the early 70s? Yes. All right. They're such a great pack. I will always use my Keltie. So we traveled every summer, and our longest trip was about 6 weeks, where we went out and traveled about 200 miles, walking all over the Brooks Range and climbing mountains and floating rivers. This is a nameless lake on the way to Schrader Peters Lake above the Hula Hula. I just love the picture. You're looking out towards Mount Michelson. And I remember sitting by this lake and thinking, oh, really would like to climb Mount Michelson. What an amazing view you'd have from the top of that mountain. And so about 2 years later, we did. And that was the summit of Mount Michelson. We got up there. It was a very difficult climb given the route we chose, which was not a good route. It was too steep and icy, but we got to the top, and you could just see forever a sea of mountains going all the way to Canada. And then looking north, it was actually foggy on the coastal plain, so we didn't get to see too far that direction. But what a sea of mountains. And, of course, now it would look quite different in July. You wouldn't see as much snow. The glaciers have receded. It wouldn't look like this as it did in the late 70s because of climate change and the melting of the glaciers. But we were on top of the world. This is just at the base of Mount Michelson, and there's a great feeling when you're up on these mountains. They're not as high as Denali. They only go up to the 8,000 and 9,000 foot level, the Romanzoff Mountains, but they are the highest mountains in the Brooks Range. And they were named after Count Romanzoff of Russia, who was very much interested in science and discovery. I forget who was the explorer. It might have been Sir John Franklin or somebody that was up there thought that was a good name for those mountains. And this inspired me to write. So through the course of between 1975 and into the 1980s, I think we made a trip to the Arctic Refuge almost every summer. And so I kept journals, never thinking that I would write a book. I just wrote because I was inspired and because of the beauty and of all the wildlife we were seeing. And on one of our early trips, we walked across the coastal plain, and this is the area that's been proposed for oil drilling, for many, many years. And on many days, you've got this open freedom of space where you can see forever. And you might not see a lot of wildlife. Maybe you see birds nesting beneath a tussock, but maybe you're not going to see caribou that day. Maybe you see a musk ox. Maybe you see a wolf or an Arctic fox. But you have this unlimited, unrestricted visibility because there are no trees. And the tundra just goes on, and it's just a wonderful feeling to be able to look up at those Romanzoff Mountains. And you're looking now at Mount Michelson, from a distance from the coastal plain, and they look huge, even though they're only 8,000, 9,000 feet. On another trip with Abe Thayer, who was the first manager for the Arctic Range, we did a wilderness assessment study, and we hiked up the Cataturik River and the Marsh Creek near the Saddle Roget Mountains, and that's what you're looking at here in June. This was the coldest trip that I ever experienced in the Arctic. We went in early June. It was a particularly late cold spring, so the temperatures were in the low 30s for most of our trip. And we had hail and sleet and snow, but it was still an incredible sight to see those Saddle Roget Mountains. And Ave was a strong proponent of wilderness and protecting the coastal plain, and this is something that he stated before the House of Representatives in a hearing in 1988. I really love this quote of his. "We should leave the flowered meadows, the rounded hills, and clear brooks untracked, and leave the animals free to continue their ancient ways. We should not take nature apart. We should not take the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge apart." And that was in 1988 when there was a strong movement to drill on the Arctic Refuge. There was a bill that was going quickly through the Senate, And there was a lot of support. There was a lot of drill, baby drill going on in 1988. And then in 1989, something happened that was devastating to the state with the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Happened the following year. And that sort of put on the brakes. Legislation to drill in the Arctic Refuge slowed down because of that oil spill. People were in Alaska. I can still remember my 2-year-old daughter watching the news and seeing oiled feathers of birds and sea mammals, and she would say, "Mommy, when will the oil spill be over?" And she'd get really teary about it. She was really sad to see all these creatures that were getting hurt from this horrible spill that we had. But it did slow down the movement to open the Arctic Refuge. On that trip with Abe, we did see musk oxen. And if you've never heard of musk ox, this is a great recording. This was not recorded here. It was recorded near Nome. And hopefully it will be able to be heard. Can you hear that a little bit? Don't know how to get. That'll be a question for the tech people, how to get sound to be louder, because I have it up all the way. It's up all the way. Yeah, it's up. So anyway, sorry about that. You can't hear. They just sound like lions. And when Nels was recording the muskox, he had one actually charge him. So it was kind of nip and tuck there, but he got a really wonderful recording. So the Lapland longspur, another bird we saw on that particular trip, is the most abundant breeder. We saw, hundreds of Lapland longspurs, and they were, singing in the wind, singing through the sleet. They have this ability to entertain you by, they don't have trees to perch on, so they fly up and they hover, almost like they're sitting on a branch. And then they sing and they glide down, and they are just the most joyful song to hear when it's 30 degrees and the wind is howling. The Lapland longspurs are singing. So it's a great bird that I think of when we think of the Arctic tundra. And of course, on other trips, we were lucky enough to experience this. On this particular day, we were near the Agakshrak River, and we were watching a group of musk oxen. And I looked over my shoulder, and in the distance, I saw what I thought was a mirage, little figures sort of bubbling up from the tundra because it was a very warm day. And it turned out to be about 50,000 caribou. And they were coming in a procession right toward us. So this was quite a remarkable moment. Maybe I'll read just a little bit of that if you can bear with me while I find the page. Shoulder to shoulder, they stream across the tundra, a tide of undulating bodies, gracefully moving across miles of tussock-covered terrain. A whispering chant of grunts and bleats fills the summer air in rhythm with the herd's steady pace. As they come closer, the voices grow louder. It is difficult to judge distances on this expansive coastal plain, but they appear to be less than 1 mile away. My heart continues to race as I stand spellbound. They are coming closer. The sounds grow louder. One of the world's greatest wildlife spectacles, and we are here to witness it. The minutes seem like hours. Soon the tundra before us is flooded with caribou. There is barely a trace of ground through the mass and clutter of hooves. Where the tundra appeared empty only a few minutes ago, now it is a moving mass of flesh and blood. Month-old lanky calves bleat for their mothers. Mothers extend their necks and muzzles, mooing for their calves. Most of the caribou are cows with calves, although we spot a number of yearlings, juveniles, and bulls mixed in with the herd. So that was written really about the time that we were seeing all these animals, or after we had just experienced that, and we were surrounded by caribou. It was one of the most incredible moments in terms of wildlife that I've ever experienced in life. Little calves. And then one year I got to help the Department of Fish and Game do a census of the caribou, and that was an adventure. So my job was to clean the lens where they took the photographs. And the lens was in the belly of the plane. So in order to clean the lens, they had to open the hatch, pull back the lens, and the tundra is racing below you. And you're seeing, the caribou, you're not that far above them, and you're high enough so you don't disturb them, but you're close enough where you feel like if you fall, you're going to land on an antler. And so I'm wiping with, paper towels, the oil off the lens so they can get a clear picture of the caribou, and just really trying to keep my balance and have this vision of, falling through and landing on the tundra. But that's what the census is all about. When they gather together, when it gets hot and buggy, the caribou will mass together, and that's when they take all the photos to do a real true photo census, where they count every single animal in the photograph so they get an exact number. And back in the early 80s, there were about 110,000 caribou in the porcupine caribou herd. That's what you're looking at. And today, the current figure is almost 200,000. The last census they had was in 2013, and it's about 197,000 is what they're saying, and the herd is growing. So this is good. This is a good thing to hear, that the caribou are doing well. They're on an uphill swing. Of course, they have their ups and downs, as all herds do. But we got to see them crossing rivers and following the braided rivers that you have that come down from the Brooks Range and go into the Beaufort Sea. We got to follow them out, and even some of them were going out into the Beaufort Lagoon onto the sea ice because it was a very warm, buggy day. And when you get out on floating ice, you get away from the mosquitoes. So it's called insect relief habitat, is what the biologists call it. And there they were, not walrus, but caribou. And interestingly, the federal government argued before the Supreme Court that the U.S. Department of Interior should manage these lagoons between the barrier islands and the mainland, and they won that case, the federal government. The state of Alaska wanted to have these lagoons for possible drilling for oil in the future. So it was a very long case. Federal government won. The Arctic Refuge includes the barrier islands and these lagoons that you're looking at. They are protected as part of the refuge. So Arctic fox. So I was sitting on the tundra, and this fox walked up the beach, and we looked at each other, raised his tail, barked a little bit at me, and then I clicked one picture. He heard that click, and off he went. In the winter, they turn pure white. This picture was taken actually by Jim Davis. Now, I don't think he's here tonight, but he used to live in Fairbanks. And it's a beautiful picture of an animal that is so well adapted in the winter. They're active all winter long, the small mammal with this incredibly thick, dense fur coat. And they've done studies on Arctic foxes. As far as being a small mammal, they are able to withstand the cold like no other. They don't start to feel chilly until it gets to about 40 below zero. That's when they start feeling a little chilly. So they have just incredibly 2 coats of fur, underwool, thick tail, fur-covered ears, and they are just happy as can be in the Arctic. Polar bears. This is a wonderful picture taken by Richard Nelson, and really love this picture where he was up recording the sounds of polar bears. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to hear them, but maybe it's loud enough. Polar bear is pretty loud, so maybe we'll be lucky. Okay. We won't worry about that one because that one doesn't seem to be playing. But polar bears, as we know, are in trouble. A lot of changes since those first early trips in the 1970s with the thinning of the ice, loss of ice, changing seasons, polar bears having to swim a long way to find a platform of ice to crawl up on, to rest on, to hunt on. So it's a much tougher time for the polar bears now than, say, 40 years ago. We know about climate change now. We know that the cubs have an extremely difficult time, that the mortality rate is much higher now, that cubs drown because they can't swim forever. So it's a time of worry for the Beaufort sea population, which could eventually become extinct. They need seals in order to survive. They need to hunt those seals, and they need ice to do that. And there's nothing that can really replace a seal on land that has that much fat, because a seal is about 50% fat, and that's what keeps those polar bears going. And this is coming from Steve Amstrup, who's done research for many, many years. He's the one that's talking about the seals being so critical and how difficult it is for a bear to not be able to find those seals on the ice. This is a great shot of a polar bear track and a human track, and I look at it as a metaphor. Polar bear has the bigger paw, but we certainly are stomping them out with the increased use of fossil fuels and the CO2, getting higher and higher, and the need to curtail the use of fossil fuels. Rebecca Noblin, who I've not met, I think says it succinctly. She says it clearly. In the long run, the only way to save polar bears in the Arctic is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And she's with the Center for Biological Diversity. So that's something that I think we have to really look to, is curbing those emissions if we're going to make a difference. Let's talk about the champions. One of the things that brings me back to the Arctic year after year are the birds. We have the champions in the Arctic from every continent except Europe. The northern wheatear that flies all the way to Africa, to and from Africa every year, that nests in rock cavities, and the feathers match those rocks that you're looking at. The black lichens and the limestones match the feathers so that they can't be seen very easily. And this is a shot that Hugh Rose took of a parent feeding an insect to a juvenile. And just imagine that this bird you're looking at was probably next to an elephant or a zebra in eastern Africa in February. And then it takes off and migrates 8,000 miles across Eurasia, across the Bering Strait, into the Brooks Range, raising its young. And when these young birds are only about a month or a month and a half years old, they take off and they go to Africa. Hi, Sean and Sharon. Did you guys come in late? I didn't see you guys. Did you sneak in? Oh, my God. So great to see you. Isn't that? Well, that's what happens, when you get older. People are sitting right in front of you. Anyway, amazing birds, the northern wheatear, one of my favorites. And a juvenile. This one here is about a month, maybe a month and a half old. I love this picture that Hugh Rose took, because it looks like that little juvenile is saying, okay, everybody, which way is Africa? That little bird is going to fly to Africa from Alaska. How could this possibly happen? It is a miracle. And then this is another miracle. Fran Maurer shared with me a wonderful book that tells the story of this eastern yellow wagtail that nests in the Arctic Refuge and other places in the Brooks Range, and then it flies south to Southeast Asia and spends the winter in places like Borneo. And there's a group of people in Borneo that live in a place that is so cloud-shrouded on the side of these mountains that they rarely see the moon or the sun. It's always cloud-covered. So they don't have a calendar that is based on the moon's cycle. Instead, they have a calendar that revolves around birds. And when this bird arrives in that area of Borneo, That is the month of September, and that is their signal to plant their rice. When this bird that is born in the Arctic arrives in Borneo, people start planting their rice. Now, isn't that amazing? I just think that's one of the most beautiful stories about the Arctic Southern Hemisphere connection. I love that story. Thanks, Fran, for sharing that book by, I forget his name, Harrison or something. Thanks. And the yellow warbler. Now, here's another one. Okay, imagine this. This little bird, the yellow warbler, there are 90 species of warblers in the world. And the smallest, one of the smallest ones, and the ones that go the farthest north, are the yellow warbler and the Wilson's warbler. Now, they only weigh 1/3 of an ounce. 1/3 of an ounce, which means you could take a first-class stamp and mail 3 of them somewhere. I mean, we're talking light as a feather, not to be, it's a pretty bad pun. But, so these guys are light, and they go as far south as Bolivia. And I've seen them nesting at Saddle Roget Springs, which is on the north side of the Brooks Range, in willow bushes. And you think this tiny little fluff of life is going to fly that many thousands of miles and come back to its birthplace the next year, the yellow warbler, one of our smallest songbirds that comes to the Arctic. And the tundra swan, one of our largest that come to the Arctic, wingspan 7 feet, weighs 15 or more pounds, and they end up going to places like Chesapeake Bay and the Carolinas, and amazing bird that we have on the coastal plain and the wetlands where they nest and mate for life, and the golden plover. This one is the ambassador for South America. So the ones that we see in the Arctic Refuge fly all the way to the Pampas of Argentina, those plains that roll out from the mountains. Incredible migration. And I wrote a book about the Pacific golden plover, a bird that goes back and forth from Hawaii to Alaska, more on the western part of our state. And then here's the one that is, well, this one will blow you away. The Arctic tern, we probably all recognize it. They've done some research on this bird, and they put little geolocators on them. This is in Greenland. Same species, but over in Greenland. This bird has been tracked for 48,000 miles of travel in 1 year. They spend most of their life in the air. They spend most of their life in sunshine. They rarely see darkness. So this bird sees more light. This animal sees more light than any creature on Earth, and it travels farther than any creature on Earth. And it's all been statistically charted by this incredible scientist in Greenland who put this little geolocator on the leg of the bird. So he figured out, and I didn't believe it. I did the math, and I said, I still don't believe it, but it's true. So the Arctic tern can live as long as 30 years. They're a long-living bird. And this scientist who studied him and studied the species in Greenland figured out that if an Arctic tern lived to be 30 years old, that means it would fly, based on his research, to the moon and back 3 times in its life. Wow. I said, wow. I said, that can't be true. And then it is true. I mean, if hypothetically, if he flew that distance every year for 30 years, it would be going to the moon and back 3 times. And I was like, wow, okay. Arctic tern, first place, maybe a children's book. The American tree sparrow. Now here's a bird you see all across the continental United States. It's a very common bird. We see them in the willows. Again, it's a bird that we see in Fairbanks. Lovely little bird. And their nest, built out of ptarmigan feathers. The Pacific loon, another, in the Arctic, we're lucky. We get to see all of the species of the different loons in the Arctic Refuge, except for the yellow-billed. They're farther west in the NPRA, but these are the Pacific loons. And the willow ptarmigan. I'm going to hope that the sound works on this, but we'll see. Let's see if I can get this going here. No sound. It's not wanting to play sound now. Well, we'll have to mess with that later, but we all know the ptarmigan call in this room, I am sure. They're a very important bird, and particularly in the winter, a year-round resident, a bird that actually has saved people's lives. On the coastal plain of the Arctic Refuge, there was a ship, the Carluck, that ran into ice, and the crew overwintered on the coastal plain, and they were shooting about 20 ptarmigan a day to stay alive. So this is one of the few year-round birds that you see up on the coastal plain. Thick feathers, hardy bird, and when I worked on the Arctic Wings book, I had this wonderful job of writing about the songbirds in the Arctic Refuge, and so my goal was to see the 20 regular breeders that were north of the divide, that were largely on the coastal plain. And to do that, I decided to take a route where I would go up into the saddle of Rogets, along the riparian environment on the rivers, and I went with my good friend Annie Caulfield, who many of you know. And this picture is taken up above Sunset Pass on the way to Weller Mountain, which we climbed. And there's Annie, for those of you that know Annie Caulfield, who we did this trip together, and we hiked about 75 miles in order to study these different breeding birds. And this is right on a fault line where you walk down to Sunset Pass up to what are called the Tors. And this is a place where there was an earthquake at one point, and half of the mountain fell into the valley. And that's what you're looking at when you're walking around this rubble pile. These pinnacles is the result of an earthquake. And while we were there, can you see something in this picture that looks feathered? The very top of that cliff is a pair of gyrfalcons. See those little white dots? Way at the top. And their nesting site is on a ledge, and you can see there's like a big crack in the cliff. They're right in that crack, so you can't really see the young birds. Here's a close-up of the gyr, though, that Hugh Rose took. That's what a gyrfalcon looks like, and they live in the Arctic year-round. If there's enough food, if there are enough ptarmigan, they'll stay in the Arctic through the winter. Amazing, our largest falcon, beautiful bird. And this is like one of my most favorite pictures of Hugh Rose's, because to me it looks like this young gyrfalcon has just discovered its talon. You know how babies do that? Those of you that have had kids, they discover their hand and they do this. Do you remember that? Well, that's what it looks like that bird is doing. It's like, wow, I've got a talon, man. What can I do with this? I can catch a ptarmigan, maybe. Gyrfalcons, really amazing birds to watch, especially how they attack their prey. They really are like a stealth, coming down really low and take them by surprise. And the white-crowned sparrow. So along the rivers, we saw a lot of white-crowned sparrows, American tree sparrows on this trip. But then our favorite location, Saddle Roget Springs. This is a really unique place where 55-degree water comes out of the mountain year-round. So surprisingly, as we got to this location, we heard American dippers singing. And if you look really carefully, you can see a dipper nest. Do you see a little beak sticking out of that mossy? Right above the waves, there's a little teeny beak. That is the nest in the middle of a river. And there's the parent that's just fed the chick and is about to fly off. And we got to see the little chicks take their first steps out of the nest. That was really amazing. Hopping around on the rocks and crossing these little riffles, the dippers. Well, a little bit about the people. We're kind of running into close to 8 here. I don't want to have you all fall asleep. So But I wanted to mention a little bit about the importance of wilderness for kids. And just so important to share wilderness with children. Our oldest daughter, Robin, she learned how to walk on the coastal plain. And just like any mother and any father would do, you know how you take your pictures of your kids taking their first few steps? I'm lying on the tundra thinking, oh, wow, there she's got that big clump of dirt. She's really exploring the environment. And, next thing I know, she's down. And it's like, oh, wow, okay. But then there are no tears, there's no crying, and she just pops right back up, and she, is off and running again. And, she grows up and she starts discovering, feels like a little scientist and discovers the antlers. And then Casey comes along, who's now 26. And so this was a great place of adventuring for the kids when they were little. I loved taking the kids to the Arctic Refuge, such a place of discovery where you might see a wolf in the distance. And then in 1990, we had a really special guest. After Midnight Wilderness was released, it turned out that former President Jimmy Carter and Rosalind took a trip to Alaska. And they were doing a documentary on his life, the Discovery Channel, and part of that documentary was filmed in the Arctic Refuge. And it just so happened that we were camped up there, and he and his wife Rosalind came in with 3 Secret Service, and they brought this huge lunch in a cooler, and they spent the day with us fishing at Okpillik Lake. And Robin was so thrilled because she taught Jimmy Carter how to fish. And she had a Mickey Mouse pole, and he didn't. So I'll never forget this. He went right along with it, and she's saying, this is how you cast, President Carter. You go like this. And he's listening. Okay, Robin, okay. Of course, he's an avid fisherman, as a fly fisherman, right? So off we go to this lake, and sure enough, President Carter catches a nice grayling in the lake. He pulls it in, takes it off the hook, and throws it back. And Robin had never seen that before because we fish to eat. And so, of course, she goes storming up to President Carter. President Carter, what are you doing? We eat the fish. It was hilarious. So he gave her a piggyback ride on that and lots of laughs over that. But it was wonderful having them there, and truly a man that loves nature, that writes about nature, that cares about Alaska, that really knew the Alaska Lands Act, every page of it, every designation, every park, every refuge, every forest area. He had those maps in the Oval Office and studied them and worked with the Secretary Andrus at the time in coming up with the boundaries, talking to guides, and listening to Alaskans and Americans. And really a hero for all of us, because without that legislation, we would not have all of these parks and refuges, 100 million acres designated under the Lands Act, and including the extension to the Arctic Range and the renaming of it as an Arctic Refuge, doubling the size of it to almost 20 million acres. So our hero, who said that year in 1990, he said, have we lost our way that we are prepared to sacrifice a one-of-a-kind wilderness for a shot at a small and temporary supply of oil? So those were his words. He really felt that there had been a line drawn at the Canning River, and that everything west, Prudhoe Bay, open to the state of Alaska, NPRA certainly for oil and gas, but the Arctic Refuge, there's a boundary line. We don't cross it. It's a wildlife refuge, and it's there for its wilderness, wildlife values. Well, it takes a nation to raise a refuge. And after his visit, we had a really close call. In 1991, the House and the Senate passed a budget with a rider on it that opened up the Arctic Refuge to oil drilling. It actually passed both houses. That's the closest we've ever been to losing the refuge. President Clinton vetoed that. Thank goodness. So we still have the refuge. But after that time, we really started moving into education. The conservation groups really stepped it up. And one of the great things that happened in the 90s was that somebody here tonight, a woman named Pam Miller, started taking congressional tours to the Arctic Refuge for the Wilderness Society initially, right? And this was one of those trips, and Robin and Casey were along the way. And Robin, my oldest daughter on the left, is standing next to Representative Gregory Meeks from New York, Representative Carolyn Maloney in red, and that's a former Representative Jim Greenwood from Pennsylvania. They went back to the Capitol. They became advocates. Carolyn Maloney, all she wanted to do was see a caribou. She saw one caribou, and she jumped out of her boots. She was so excited. And these people really fell in love with it and realized the importance and the significance of keeping this place wild. So those congressional tours were important. I think we need to do them again. And yet, Representative Meeks and Maloney are still in the House of Representatives, and they are co-sponsors for the Wilderness Bill right now. So they're with us. And there's Pam, protecting the coastal plain. Thank you, Pam. And Don Ross, who's I don't think is here tonight, but Don was often up there on those trips, flying people in and out, and he was a refuge manager for a while, the Arctic. Wonderful, Don. And Richard Feinberg is here tonight. So we had the two things going on here. We had people coming to the Arctic to learn about it, to see it, to become advocates for it. But we also had Alaskans going to D.C., going to Wilderness Week that the Alaska Wilderness League has sponsored. Many of these wilderness weeks, which you're all invited to consider becoming a part of. You go back for a week, you lobby on the Hill, you meet with senators and representatives from other states, and you bring the Alaska story to those people's offices. It's a real story. It's heartfelt. It's your story and why the Arctic is important. So we welcome people to go to those wilderness weeks. And this was the Climate Action Day that we had, the very first one in 2007. And I forget who we were talking to because you're pretty tired after a day of lobbying, but maybe Richard remembers. No, you don't remember either. I don't remember who it was, but somebody might. Oh, Peter Tafazio from Oregon. Right. He was one of our supporters, right? Yes, still is. I think he's still there. So this is what we do when we go to D.C. And we go back there to be the voice for the bears. The grizzly bears, the polar bears, the golden plover chicks, the caribou calves, and for our kids, and for our grandkids. It's Robin when she was 6. So when they grow up, maybe this place will still be there for their kids. The Arctic Refuge Coastal Plain, a beautiful picture by Fran Maurer, which became a Sierra Club poster. So that is the place that could be official wilderness if Congress acts. And since Obama has done such a great job moving that recommendation to Congress, you know, after the program, there are some cards out on the table that the Alaska Wilderness League has sent out. And if you want to sign those cards, it's a thank you note, basically, to President Obama, thanking him for moving forward and getting this wilderness proposal to Congress. And now the House of Representatives has that bill active. It's been introduced to establish this as formal wilderness, which it's about time. It needs that layer of protection. So that's something you could do tonight. If you want to write a postcard, it would be awesome to thank him. We're just thanking him at this point and hoping that Congress acts. And then I just want to thank the people, the Gwich'in people of Arctic Village, for sharing their world and traditional knowledge, for Hugh Rose for all the photographs you saw of the birds, Richard Nelson for the sounds you didn't get to hear, but you will next time, and to the Fish and Wildlife Service and the conservation community for their dedication. Really, a lot of work. It takes a nation to raise a refuge. There's so many people in this room that have had a hand in that. And it's, a big thank you to every single person that keeps, vigilant, that cares, because it's all about caring. It's all about being active and caring. Writing letters to the editor, speaking out, thanking President Obama. And I know our delegation may not be the best listeners. We still need to let them know how we feel so that we are in their rearview mirror. That this place is too special to think about drilling. And a big thanks to Nels for the sounds that you will hear next time. And a big thanks to Hugh Rhodes. Special thanks to Hugh Rhodes, who's probably out in the wilderness right now taking more pictures. He's a fabulous photographer, guide, and friend. So, and that's it, everybody. Thank you so much. We're supposed to do Q&A. Maybe if there are any questions, happy to answer a few questions, and then I'm happy to sign books if anybody wants a book. But do we have questions about the Arctic? Anything? Yes.
One thing you didn't mention about the terns is they fly all the way from Antarctica all the way to the coastal plain, and then they lay one egg on the ground.
One egg. Thank you. I didn't know that. I wasn't sure if it was one or two. One egg. So thanks for bringing that up, because that reminds me that this is sort of interesting. I learned this today, so I'm really thinking it would be a great kids book. That the Arctic tern, on its first migration, like those little guys when they're only, a month or two old. Okay, so they fly this, 20,000 miles. They get down to Antarctica. They don't come back the first year. They don't come back till the second year. So that tells me that they're kind of going, whew, that's a long way for a little bird. Like, I'm going to get really fat and strong before I do that again. So they stay. They don't do it for the 2 years, and then they come back, and then they keep coming. It's a phenomenal migration. Hi, Anthea. I just saw some new people coming in. Yes.
President Obama's recommendation, is that for the entire refuge, or I thought I heard you say 12 million acres?
Yeah, it's about 12 million acres. It's not the entire refuge. Now, there's a really good map. As you walk out at the northern center table, they've got a nice shaded map that shows you the highlighted area that's been proposed. So it's the coastal plain, and then it's the southern extension area that's largely to the west of Arctic Village, I believe, and Vinicai. Is that right, Pam? Pam.
The simplest way to say it is there's about almost 9 million acres that got passed as part of ANWR. So almost all the old refuge is designated wilderness, but they left out the coastal plain, which was part of the original refuge. Then they left out some land just north around Peckholder, a little bit of land in the lagoons there, and then they, as a result of their community meetings, and they left out some north of Arctic Village.
Yeah.
But otherwise, it's the rest of the refuge.
It's pretty much it's a huge,
Kind of around Arctic Village.
huge designation. I mean, it would be, I think, the greatest wilderness designation that we've had in many, 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 many years. And interestingly, maybe things are changing a bit. I'm sort of an optimist, but I was looking at the history of the Wilderness Act, and you'll be interested in this. Maybe you guys know this, but I didn't know this. So I was reading that the House of Representatives in 1964, when they voted to pass the Wilderness Act, there was only one dissenting vote. Wow, what a different time. One dissenting vote. It was a guy from Texas, of course. Somebody named Poole, one guy, but only one guy. And I read a little bit about him. I said, why was he the only guy that didn't vote for it? It turns out he has some impoundment named after him. Like a little dam is named after him in Texas. So he was into building dams, not into wilderness. So, yeah, that was a different time. I think people love wilderness. I mean, it's part of our heritage. It's who we are. And there's only about 5 or 6% of the United States is official wilderness. Just a very small amount.
H.R. 39, which was the bill that was introduced in 1978, it ended up going through, it passed the House, I think it was 401 to 19.
Wow.
With a few people abstaining. But that,
Yeah.
yeah,
Different
that was,
time. It's time. It's time for more wilderness. I think we've kind of, and Sean, you know, if you don't know Sean's story, Sean, if I've got this right, for H.R. 39 in 1970, whatever, walked across the country in support of the Lands Act, right?
Yukon River to Key West.
Yeah, Yukon River to Key West he walked. And yeah, here's to that. Wow. But there's a story about this. It wasn't just a regular walk, because he made it as far as North Pole, right? And he got hit by a truck. And you were out for how long?
6 weeks.
6 weeks, and then you went right back out.
It was initially a run, and after the accident, it was a walk.
That is an amazing story. You need to write an essay about that or a book about that. That is, like, incredible. I mean, everybody in this room, and I'm looking around, you know, like Axel, you've done amazing trips in the Arctic, and Mary Claire and I, we, you know, went all over Cane Creek. Everybody's had an adventure that I'm looking at in the Arctic Refuge. So these are stories that stay with you for a lifetime. And we just need to share them so that people realize we have to protect this place forever. And who was it that was saying that I just met tonight? You were saying you were so worried, right? Was it you about that we might lose the refuge? You're afraid they're going to get in there. And I said to her that the last thing I said to Marty Murray before I left her home in Moose, Wyoming, when she was 98, she was very concerned like you. And I promised her that nothing would happen. So that was a big promise. So nothing can happen, because I've made that promise, and I would go up there and do what the Portland people would do, but I don't know what I'd hang from. No bridges to hang from, but yay, Portland, go Portland. That was amazing. If anybody saw the video of these kids that were hanging from a bridge, it's civil disobedience, and, you know, you got to speak out, and that's taking it to the top, or to the top, to the bottom, or whatever. I'm talking way too long. I know you guys are all probably very tired, but it's just so wonderful to see so many friendly, familiar faces, and you're so nice to come out, and I hope to see some of you berry picking or at the library or wherever else you hang out. I hope to catch up with all of you, and if anybody wants a book, I'm happy to autograph for your kids or yourself or whatever. Unless there's another question, then we could stay all night. Current project is a long one. It's probably a 4 or 5 year project. I'm writing a book with Hugh Rose is the photographer from Fairbanks, and we're working on a book about the wilderness study area of the Chugach National Forest in Prince William Sound. A little secret place down there, and it's the only wilderness study area in the Lands Act, under the Lands Act, that nothing's ever happened to it. It's still a study area. So we're trying to get that across the finish line so that it becomes official wilderness down the road. And it's the only national forest that doesn't have designated wilderness in the country, which really surprised me. We're talking Harriman's Fjord, College Fjord, Columbia Glacier. This is all part of that wilderness study area. So that's where I've been the last 2 summers, is exploring that, photographing it, writing about it. And it's an amazing place south of Anchorage that if you haven't been there, wow, what a surprise. It's really magnificent. Different kind of wilderness, but really magnificent. So, last question? Any more questions? It's a great group. I want to introduce Allie, who is with the Alaska Wilderness League, and she's she just happened to be in town here, and she's our development director for the league. And I would like to say something about conservation. A lot of you here belong to the Northern Alaska Environmental Center, maybe Audubon, maybe Wilderness Watch. There are a lot of really great groups working on this issue. I just want to say, it's really important to support conservation. And whether it's local or national, I happen to believe that we need both. We need people here in Fairbanks working on this issue. We need people in D.C. working on this issue. And so I'm affiliated with the Alaska Wilderness League that's based in D.C., but we have a field office here and in Anchorage and in Barrow. We have field directors all across the country. We're a national organization, and we're the only organization that just focuses on Alaska's public wild lands. Like Sierra Club does a lot of great work, but they focus on lands all across the country. We only focus on Alaska, and we're based in D.C. And so Allie lives in Seattle, and it's great that you're here and is doing wonderful things for the league. And so she'd be happy to chat with you if anybody's interested in learning more. I'd be happy to chat with you about that. So I belong to the Northern Center and the Alaska Wilderness League, and I encourage you to do both if you care about protection, because a lot of decisions are made in D.C. as well as Fairbanks, Alaska. It's good to be in both places, you know, for protecting our public lands. That's my, conservation spiel. Any questions about the Alaska Wilderness League? Or Northern Center is here and can answer questions about what they're doing here in Fairbanks. Longtime organization. And I thank you again for coming. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much.
I should get out there in case people. Can I leave this here for a moment and sign books and then come back? All right. Is that okay? Just in case people are waiting. Hi there.
We're going to sign books here or
I'm
somewhere else?
going to go out there. Just because the books are out there. That's right. Unless you want me to. That's fine. I mean, I'm going to look at the one now, and then you won't have to wait in line.
Thank you.
I might have to put you to sleep.
Oh,
No, too long.
no. It's so interesting.
Okay, so this would be to
Karen.
Karen.
Welcome to the Fairbanks Watercolor Society. She was in a hospital taking stress tests.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
She just looked from her last Friday night. Karen.
Karen.
I don't want to be in the picture. All right. Okay.
Oh,
right, Pam, step in closer to Debbie a little bit, then 1, 2. Okay, that's good. And then get it to Corey.
So, Allie.
Thank you for doing this.
Thank you very, very much. Appreciate that. And thanks for coming and all those things.
She used to take the Owen Beach party.
Yes, let me give you my card.
Oh, yeah. You see you everywhere.
How are you? My email on there, my website, all that kind of stuff.
Do you live here or where do you live in and out of? Okay, so we'll just send you an email and let you know that's where I am. Yeah.
Summer is the best time. The right month, like this actually might be a good time. August.
I'll write that down.
All right.
Thank you. Keep up the work.
So we searched them a lot. Now they're ready to read the big people's book. Gotta remind them. But
That's good.
They were there from the beginning.
it is hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will.
something that is very useful.
I figured it was better to clear than to try to.
You're all doing not using the record is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I didn't try that. I never said that. Oh, yeah.
But you had the short quote from
Jimmy Carter. That brought in numbers. Yeah, I had some other
so
ones
long
too,
that
but.
was, yeah, that was really self-effective. But this is really the strongest when women drivers, I think, although I still think for me, I really believe in me, I just think people are maybe overworking a lot. But
We need
this,
conservation and
the conservation operation.
yeah, conservation outweighs oil. And by doing very little, you save so much oil when you drive. You need to go into serious and expense and loss.
But this is so strong that shows that that's not, medicine is not equal to the disease and
Appreciated it. I didn't have any graphs or anything. God, I really failed.
no, that's right. No. So,
Oh, probably not. Here's the thing. So we're having this big push. Sending thank yous to Obama. Obama needs to get a lot of thank yous. Yes, he supported his use of aliens and he just doesn't. Executive level. That's what's happening. Right to the range, you know, it was established. Yeah, we'll chat.
something that's a convenience and taste some
I will.
wonderful.
Let's get
And
together.
it's really
Visit
well
more.
done.
Thank you. Thank you. All right.
Too.
Actually, not for me, not for Lori, but for their development. Claire, folders, just to take that over, continue that. That finding.
Yeah, I do the finder.
We have been running an umbrella. So yeah, some things are definitely different and I noticed that when you open up the folder, there's different documents. So we have to navigate some of the highlights. I don't think that I have
For a lot of what's gone on.
maybe I just need to take a copy of that.
People like Sean walking across the country, Richard doing the economics of the numbers. And I look around the room and, you know, a lot of this stuff that happens. Check those areas. It's right here, man. It's grassroots.
Larry Mayo claims that some of the greatest conservation work in the history of the world was done during the Gene series.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree when you think that.
And he says he's not joking. When you look at what you scale of what they projected.
Yeah. No kidding.
Wildlife Refuge, Yilka, Lapland Dam, Project Chariot. Stage, you know, you literally have a dozen people.
Yeah, it's it. That was a really like
one, but I mean, not that we just camping, rest on our person. And this is for the Clarabelle again. How's your back? Yeah, how's your back?
Better and better. Better every day. I guess we need to get back to like doing some sort of sitting on my butt.
I did a chai gong today, and it's a really good one because it's all very gentle. Yeah, she's doing it Friday at the Heart
Really enjoys both of these.
Center. She loves it. It's like, you know, this whole thing about you and she and you do funny things and stuff, but it's like, it's at noon. What day? This Friday. And then next Wednesday, she will be the last one at Plant Kingdom at noon. And then she does it at Mary's Side. And it's really, the ones during the summer are free outside, and she charges like $3. It's like,
There's a yoga place close to my house, and I gotta find the right.
you have to find the right one.
I don't find the right class.
Right. Well, right. I did yoga with the Summer Arts Festival, and it was, you know, there's a lot of planks, and it was like, I could do these planks. And then we started to like, show you this.
Then you gotta start with the like on your knee, planks on your knee.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's really. I mean, I know I have arthritis in my shoulders. I don't know if that's one. But anyway, it's like, but the chai and the Tai Chi probably much good because it does kind of help your core as well. Yeah, and it's, you know, and there's enough, so you get, you're working with your